Thank you for being here. This is one of those classes where we don't have somebody sharing a racial roadmap today, but it is another one of those days where we look at where racism is perhaps manifest in a different system. And so today we're going to continue with our housing conversation. We have Dr. Evelyn Perry, who is an assistant professor of sociology at Rhodes College. She is here with us today. She began this discussion last week and continues with us today. I'm also told that she goes by Evie. So Evie is here with us, and we're grateful that she's here. We had kind of a fun moment on the Wednesday call.
Okay, I'm about to turn
where
sound
she
off.
realized that Ann and John Jones, who I think she knows through yoga, were on the call. And that was just really neat, sort of seeing, I don't know, these different ways that we are connected, even in the midst of pandemic. So I am going to lead us through an opening prayer and through Lectio Divina to begin, as we normally do, and then I'm going to hand it over to Evie. And just a reminder to everyone, especially once I start, once I get going here, it's hard for me to mute you and to read and do all the things at the same time. So as you come in, please do make sure that you are muted. All right. Let us pray. Oh God, you are among us as our peace, even as we find little peace all around us. So open us now to this word, your word, both ancient and new. Open us to one another, that we might hear you today and be moved. It is in Christ's name that we trust and pray. Amen. Because we read an excerpt from Galatians, from Paul's letter to the Galatians last week, I'm going to continue with Galatians this week. And this passage is from Galatians chapter 4, it's verse 9. Following that, I'm going to read a quote from Dr. James Cone. Now, however, that you have come to know God, or rather to be known by God, how can you turn back again to the weak and beggarly elemental spirits? How can you want to be enslaved to them again? And from James Cone, any talk about God that fails to make God's liberation of the oppressed its starting point is not Christian. And now, using that chat feature, I invite you to share whatever word or phrase is still kind of churning in your mind. What word or phrase is working on you today? Starting point, not Christian. How can you turn back? How can you go back? Elemental spirits. Oppressed. Okay, I'm going to read these readings side by side again, and this time in the minute of silence that follows, I invite you to consider how God might be speaking to us through these words today. First from Galatians, and then from James Cone. Now, however, that you have come to know God, or rather to be known by God, how can you turn back again to the weak and beggarly elemental spirits? How can you want to be enslaved to them again? Any talk about God that fails to make God's liberation of the oppressed its starting point is not Christian. And now, using the chat feature, I would invite you to share as you feel led how you think God is speaking to us through these words. Elizabeth, the chapter and verse for the scripture is Galatians chapter 4, verse 9. Starting point to be Christian should be each of our strategic plan, our mission statement. Knowledge of God, being known by God, equals leaving behind old ways. What's the point if there's nothing new or radical? How can we not take risks for the gospel? To oppress is not Christian. It is important that Idlewild is always mindful to keep this starting point.
Again, which carries to me a weight of backsliding.
Thank you, Perry. Calling me to constantly ask, what is my starting point? Is it liberating? And for whom is it liberating? Amen and amen. Thank you all for taking this time. And I'm going to hand it over now to Evie.
Thank you, Sarah, and thank all of you for choosing to be together and inviting me into this space today. It is an honor to be back with you. You know, part of what this experience has invited me to reflect on is the ways in which my being raised in a pretty awesome Presbyterian community here in Milwaukee, led by Dr. Bill Johnstone and Dr. Deborah Block, really is one of the many beautiful pieces in the mosaic that I think helps shape my idea of the beloved community and my role in making it real. So I'm grateful to you for sponsoring that reflection in me. Okay, so what are we gonna do today? We spent a lot of time when we were last together talking about how did we get here? How segregated are we? What happened? And why do we continue to see such dramatic levels of segregation? Today, I'd like to continue to build on that by thinking about really what are the consequences of this dramatic racial separation and where we live, and what might we do about it? Sort of on the level of policy and the level of our everyday decisions. But before I dig in, I just wanted to pause and see if there were any lingering or burning questions from the last time that we were together. Okay, then we will dig in. So let's work our way through some of the consequences of segregation. I think many of these will be obvious to you, but maybe some less so. So first, segregation perpetuates prejudice and stereotypes and racial tensions. It really preserves some of the negative ideas and the unfair, unjust stereotypes that we have of one another, because physical distance in many ways perpetuates social distance and promotes distrust and the endurance of ignorance. I think what's important to sit with when thinking about this piece of the consequence puzzle is how residential segregation impacts white people by producing an enormous amount of white isolation. So if many white people live in separate neighborhoods and actually increasingly attend segregated schools, how do we come to learn about non-white groups? Where do we get that information? From the media, from peers who are similarly ignorant? And I think about this largely as a problem of empathy. So how do you develop real empathy when you have little real connection to the lives of folks who aren't white? I think this certainly reinforces the ideas that uphold white supremacy and systemic racism. And I think this is particularly serious for upper class white Americans who tend to live in not only racially segregated neighborhoods, but economically segregated neighborhoods, and also tend to be people on pathways to power, to representing us in government, which is overwhelmingly we are represented by rich white people, to running corporations, to holding positions of power in society. And yet it is likely that they are the least connected to non-white, non-poor other folks. I mean, poor other folks. So being in a position of power over other people and yet not having really foundational experiences to develop empathy and understanding for the other. We have many pieces of evidence that suggest this is the case, but just to share with you a recent poll by the Pew Research Center, I'm just going to highlight a couple things that came up that are actually in the land of statistical analysis of different opinions. These are huge gaps I'm about to share. So 78% of Black people said that our country hasn't gone far enough in giving Blacks equal rights with whites, whereas only 37% of whites expressed this opinion. 84% of Black people felt that racial discrimination is a major reason why Black people may have a harder time getting ahead than white people. But only 54%, of white people expressed this opinion. Typo, my fault. And finally, 74% of Black people thought that Blacks were treated less fairly than whites when applying for a loan or mortgage, something we have evidence of systemic disproportionate treatment, whereas only 38% of whites felt the same way. So we have very different definitions of what even constitutes a problem and how people experience it and how it impacts their lives. Second, segregation denies Black families access to equitable opportunities. Given our conversation last time we were together, this probably comes as little surprise that when you constrict a group's freedom of choice with respect to neighborhood, that segregation unjustly limits Black families' access to safe public spaces, to decent public transportation, to jobs, to quality health care, to public services, to private amenities like decent grocery stores, health clinics, community centers, and importantly, something I'll return to because this really matters for mobility, excludes Black students from many, many high-performing schools. This also perpetuates Black poverty and poverty concentration. So the problems associated with urban poverty become exacerbated by the isolating effect of residential discrimination. So this really helps sustain economic inequality in a variety of ways and maintains the segregation of schools. And something that I think it's really important for us to sit with is that the impacts of this are not just on poor Black families. Of course, it's enough if the impacts are on poor Black families, but this level of segregation means that even middle-class Black families are more likely to live in concentrated poverty neighborhoods. Sociologist Patrick Sharkey finds that middle-class African Americans earning $100,000 or more a year live in neighborhoods with the same disadvantages as the average white household earning less than $30,000 per year. So income does not translate into a higher quality neighborhood when we have a racist system that segregates housing. And low-income African Americans are much less likely to attend socioeconomic integrated schools than their white counterparts. So a poor white kid has, about half of poor white kids have access to socioeconomically integrated neighborhoods, and about 1 in 5 Black kids has access.
Something or other for YIG before.
This is something I hinted at when we had last chatted about wealth. The wealth gap is a big deal. And it's something that for a long time, social scientists didn't pay attention to. We just looked at income differences. We didn't look at wealth differences. But wealth, kind of the assets you have, are really important for families. They're sort of a pool of resources that you can draw upon in times of crisis, but also to help things move along and help folks get ahead with few burdens. So as we learned, we have historic wealth amassing government policies like the Federal Housing Act, the GI Bill, that facilitated property ownership and home ownership, business development and education, largely for whites, while systematically excluding similar opportunities for African Americans and other minority groups. So we have to think about what this means over time. If African American families were prohibited from buying homes in the suburbs in the 40s, 50s, and even the 60s that were subsidized by the FHA, that meant that they couldn't get any of these sort of equity appreciating boosts that white families got. So white families sent their children to college with home equities. They were able to take care of their parents in old age and then in turn not rely on their own children to care for them. They were able to hand down wealth to their children. And none of these advantages accrued to African Americans who could not purchase homes in these places. So the wealth gap then is very clearly linked to historical discrimination built into policy, but also to the kinds of contemporary discrimination that we talked about. So today, African Americans on average are about 60% of average white incomes. So that's what you're seeing on the left here. Income gap is a problem, it is significant, but it in no way maps onto the scale of the wealth gap, which is basically tenfold. So the African American wealth is about 10% of white wealth today on average. That's a huge gap and one that you can see is growing. So one of the things that I should mention is that very few people dispute that the wealth gap exists or that it's this large. These numbers are very difficult to fight against, but of course what people battle about are their notions of why it exists. And so I want to make sure that I attack some of the things that are floating around there as common sense explanations for the wealth gap. One of them is, oh, well, this is just an educational attainment problem. But college pays off far more for white people in terms of wealth accumulation than Black, Hispanic, and other non-white groups. So what you're seeing in each is a comparison between an average white person without a bachelor's degree and one with a bachelor's degree or higher. So clearly this is about more than educational attainment. People also say this is about family structure. What about all those single families? Well, the median white single parent household has more than double the wealth of the median two-parent Black household. And then another thing that people talk about is conspicuous consumption. So stereotypes about Black people spending money on things they shouldn't spend money on. But white households spend more than Black households with similar incomes across the income distribution, yet they also have more wealth. So they spend more with than Black families with similar incomes, yet they still have more wealth. So personal spending habits are not driving the racial wealth gap and cannot succeed in closing it. There are lots of people that are like, this is just simply a financial literacy program. Folks need to learn how to spend and save. That is not the problem for the most part, and it certainly is not a pathway to a solution that would be complete in any sense. And another thing to think about with the wealth gap is housing values. So white housing is just worth more. So if you compare housing in Black and white neighborhoods that are otherwise equal, so the quality of housing, the housing stock is the same, the general income level of the residents is the same, the education system is equivalent, you'll find that white housing is worth more, the exact same white housing is worth more just because it's white. So that explains part of this as well. Okay. Now I'd like to talk about housing instability. Maybe some of you have run into the work of Matthew Desmond, a sociologist who, like me, worked in Milwaukee and wrote the book Evicted. MIFA recently invited Matthew Desmond to come and speak, and share what he learned in his study of eviction. And so much what I'll share related to housing stability is linked to his tremendous work. But basically, eviction rates are disproportionately high in Black neighborhoods across the country. Why are eviction rates so high in general? Well, most poor renting families spend at least half of their income on housing, so on rent and utilities. And a quarter of those families spend over 75% of their income on housing. Usually people then say, well, what about public housing? Can't these people just get public housing? Well, about 1 in 4 people who qualify for public housing are able to get it, to take advantage of that assistance, actually receive that assistance. The waiting list for public housing in some cities is decades long. And then we need to think about what eviction does. So I should note that in Memphis, there are about 2,500 to 3,000 eviction cases each month. So lots of people lose their homes in Memphis. They lose their supportive connections that they've crafted with neighbors, their connections to local helpful places and people in their community. Usually their children miss school and have to switch schools. They often lose their possessions. So either they're put out on the curb or they are picked up and put in storage, but storage companies will charge you to get your possessions back, and many families ultimately lose their possessions. Many evictions are informal, but if someone decides to take you through the court system, you then have an eviction on your record, which it can prevent you from relocating to a better neighborhood, as landlords routinely look up your eviction record to determine whether or not they want to rent to you. It's also linked to job loss, depression, poor health outcomes, you can imagine. So this is not a separate problem from segregation. These things fuel one another. And again, they disproportionately impact folks that are living in these neighborhoods. And the housing stock in these neighborhoods is often owned by people who live nowhere near these neighborhoods and are profiting off of other people's poverty with exorbitant rents that put people at tremendous risk. Health, I think, deserves its own point here. We can think of a number of ways that segregation is linked to poor health outcomes in terms of safety, neighborhood safety, in terms of housing quality. So exposure to substandard housing and the kinds of environmental toxins like lead poisoning or increased asthma, limited access to healthy food, safe spaces to play and recreate and exercise and breathe. But I think one of the most important pieces, and we are seeing this so much right now with COVID, like in devastating ways, residential segregation gives rise to a segregated healthcare system, which is associated with worse access to medical care and lower quality of care for those who live in racially isolated, non-white neighborhoods. It is just one piece of the story of the disproportionate impact of COVID on Black and brown communities, but it is a really important piece of that story. We are talking about like doctors having different access to the ability to care for those who seek help. And I would be remiss if I didn't mention what should be obvious. Race is relational. Oppression is linked to domination. Disadvantages are linked to advantages. So segregation absolutely benefits white people. I think it harms them as well. I think it harms their souls, but it benefits their pocketbooks and their power. So white people, segregation helps white people maintain political stability and political power in white neighborhoods. It helps them maintain and encourage investment and reinvestment in those neighborhoods. They have a host of unearned advantages related to housing values and wealth creation. Absolutely better schooling opportunities for white people across the class spectrum. So this geography of opportunity, because it is uneven, benefits white folks. Okay, I'm gonna pause for a minute here and see if folks have any questions before I trudge ahead. You with me? Can I see some nods? Okay, beautiful, great. So before I talk about solutions, I just want to briefly revisit how we frame the problem in the first place, because I think there's some dangers if we frame the problem as segregation, the solution is integration, and we don't dig into what we're actually saying. So segregation is in part about people who are of different race, and economic segregation of different class living in different places. Differences only become problems when we throw power into the mix. So in a society that's organized by racial domination and defined by dramatic increases in income inequality, we most certainly have difference plus power. So we know segregation was created by racist policies, it's maintained by discriminatory practices that advantage whites and seriously limit the opportunities of Black people and systematically disinvest in their communities. So the problem isn't people living apart, the problem is institutional racism expressed in neighborhoods. And so I think it's very important to focus, as I have, on the harms of segregation, but we have to make sure that we don't tell simple stories about Black community life. So one, we don't want to conflate race and class. Not all Black people live in poor, concentrated Black neighborhoods. In fact, most Black people live in suburbs. But of course, these suburbs tend to be lower resource than their white suburban counterparts. And I think even more importantly, Black poor communities are not just spaces of deficits and disadvantages. Unjust structural conditions have been challenged and disrupted and disputed and debated by and among poor Black people. Urban Black Americans have always created sites of endurance and belonging and resistance. They're not just responding, they're creating. These are places that are also full of assets. So one challenge of contemporary housing integration efforts becomes, how do we dismantle the bad stuff, the racist policies and practices, while making sure that we don't simultaneously destroy the valuable cultural and economic and social institutions that Black communities have created. So we have to be careful in saying, well, the solution to segregation is integration. Absolutely, I think that is part of the solution, but so is investing in low-income segregated neighborhoods. I think we need all hands on deck. We need all the tools we have. And we also have to be careful that integration being a good thing is about sharing power and sharing resources. It's not about gleaming whiteness being superior and better and like bringing Black people into the greatness of white people, right? We don't want to stigmatize Black people in Black spaces as we work towards desegregation, and we don't want to stigmatize poor people. Okay, so that's my big caveat. Let's talk a little bit about solutions, and I'll be on my way. So how do we build a more equitable future? I think there are so many tools that we can use. I'm only going to highlight a few, but we have tremendous options and tremendous opportunities. We just lack some will. So the first is affirmatively further fair housing. This is a part of the Fair Housing Act that never had any teeth. And Obama's administration gave some teeth that Trump's administration took away. But what would this mean if we actually implemented and used this provision of the Fair Housing Act? We would require jurisdictions to come up with plans for taking meaningful actions, this is a quote from the act, in addition to combating discrimination that overcome patterns of segregation and foster inclusive communities. So narrowing the Black-White Housing Opportunity Act, using the legislation we have in place to compel places to do things that actually improve inclusion and access. We can also deal with the land of zoning. Sorry, this is not letting me go. So there's two sides to this. One, adopting inclusionary zoning policies. Maybe you've heard of these. They require developers to set aside a portion of all new housing units that they're building to be affordable for low and moderate income residents. So you don't just get to build your high-rise condo, you get to build your high-rise condo, and some of those units have to be affordable. This makes lots of people very upset, but I think it's a very powerful tool when we're developing new housing to make sure it benefits more than the wealthy. I also think we could create an economic and I should say other people have thought about this and I'm stealing their good ideas and sharing them with you, that we should create an economic housing act that parallels the Fair Housing Act of 1968 to curb exclusionary zoning. So this is the stuff I talked about, like minimum lot sizes, banning apartment buildings or townhouses. So just as it's illegal now to discriminate in housing based on race, it should be illegal for municipalities to employ exclusionary zoning based on income. And this is a policy that all sorts of municipalities have in place. So there are lots of ways you can do this. You can say, oh, is your town or city interested in these or your suburb, these fabulous infrastructure funds from the federal government? Great, you can have them if you get rid of exclusionary zoning, because we're not gonna give you public dollars that benefit the few. So inclusion or bust. I had a great question about gentrification last week as a tool maybe for addressing segregation, both economic and racial. So I think yes, but we need to prevent displacement in gentrifying neighborhoods, because gentrification often fosters resegregation, economic resegregation and racial resegregation. So this would allow us to encourage integration without destroying the kinds of valuable cultural and economic institutions folks have created, and making sure that people don't get priced out or pushed out of their neighborhood, which often happens when costs rise. There's lots of tools we can use to do that. I think often cities will say, here's a huge tax abatement policy that you can have as a wealthy developer, an individual who wants to come in and help change a low resource neighborhood. But those kinds of things aren't offered to the folks that live in the neighborhood. So what if, one, we said there's this enforceable stipulation requiring new businesses to employ at a living wage folks that live in the neighborhood, and then we also turned around and offered tax abatements to existing small businesses to allow them to expand and employ more people. Also just working to maintain affordable housing, implement long-time owner occupancy programs, support people in pathways to home ownership, all kinds of things we can do. And also just centering existing community members in decision-making. This is pretty self-explanatory. We have to have people that at the federal level that are combating lending discrimination. We have done this in the past. We need to do it again. And here's something that folks like Desmond, who wrote the book Evicted, talk about. So we typically spend about $70 billion on homeowner tax subsidies each year. So this is mortgage interest deduction, the biggest part of this. And this is a federal housing tax policy that basically transfers lots of money to rich homeowners, a bit less to middle class homeowners, and practically nothing to anyone else. So households earning more than $100,000 a year receive almost 90% of these benefits. And since the deduction actually rises as the cost of one's mortgage increases, the policy essentially pays upper middle class and rich households to buy larger and more expensive homes. We could lower the size of deductible mortgage debt to around $500,000 and use that money for low-income housing assistance. People who receive mortgage income deductions, they don't think about this as essentially welfare for rich people, but that's what it is, right? So they say, have you ever benefited from a federal program? Absolutely not. Did you deduct your mortgage? Then absolutely yes. So, you know, what would it take for us to decrease it to a level that does not really affect home ownership and would shift a lot of that money and make it available for helping people get stable housing? Okay. And then finally, you know, some thoughts about what this might mean for you, not just as a voter and a person who promotes certain policies, but saying, yes, I enjoy certain privileges associated with my whiteness and perhaps my class status, and I am willing to share. I don't want an unfair tax break. I don't want to live in a space where we say that poor people can't live in our neighborhood or that low-income people can't live in our neighborhood. Yes, I want to get rid of exclusionary zoning. Yes, please do build public housing in my neighborhood so that we can share. I'm not going to move out of a racially changing neighborhood. I am not going to buy my kids out of the schools they're zoned for, or send, or just move so that we can abandon those schools, because I know that that suggests that my kid deserves more than other children. And I think there's this whole other level that is just about the stories we tell about neighborhoods and people. So really interrogating the stories we tell about our own neighborhoods and our own pathways, which I know you're doing right now. But also, I'm just amazed at the stories people tell me about Memphis neighborhoods they have no experience in. They just take whole swaths of the city and characterize them as untouchable, negative, responsible for their decimation and disinvestment. You know, what are the stories that we tell? How can I push myself to reconsider the stories of place and other people and the stories of the place they live in? I grew up in a white affluent suburb called Whitefish Bay that is known around here as White Folks Bay, which should tell you something about who lives there. And I now can so clearly see that the joyful, safe, enriching upbringing is directly related, that I had, is directly related to a very different set of circumstances for people 2 miles away. And now that I'm home visiting family, I also see that the experience of COVID in this little sheltered bubble of a place is completely different from the experience. And I see residential segregation being lived in the sort of freedom and carefreeness of these people in this suburb who are just able to live life for the most part, while folks are so disproportionately harmed not very far away. So I know I've been doing this interrogation, and much to my friends and family's chagrin, forcing them to do the same. Okay, so that is what I have for you today. I wanted to make sure you had plenty of time for your conversation. But does anybody have any comments or questions before I head out? Yeah, I see Cliff, is that right?
Yeah. Hey, Evelyn.
Hi, thanks for nodding. I always appreciate it when I'm talking.
I teach by Zoom all the time. I actually make my students unmute so I can hear them. I need something. Yeah, so I'm a nodder. I have a gentrification question. What we see in Memphis and what I used to see in Jackson, Mississippi, where I lived before, were kind of two different situations. You had some families in these communities, primarily Black, who rented, and gentrification was really bad news because the landlord was going to really be sophisticated. They're going to negotiate a price and then you're out, right? So that was bad. But then you had some situations you do in Memphis and you did in Jackson where people bought these houses some years ago for $30,000, $40,000. And now a few houses in the neighborhood sell for $250,000, $300,000 because the neighborhoods have gotten cool. My son just bought a house in Cooper Young, right? So if those people own those houses and crazy white people want to come in and give them 5 times, 6 times what they paid, I mean, is that progress toward that family wealth, that kind of house, all of a sudden I got house rich, and now if I can find decent housing somewhere else and I want to take white people's money, and now I've got a little nest egg that I never would have had, does that feel like bad news to you also, assuming that they're not being, taken advantage of in the negotiation and that there's another place to go? I mean, taking white developers' money seems like that might be good news for some Black folks in places in Memphis and Jackson. Is that unfair?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I would never want to undermine somebody's ability to take a good deal and run, especially if it is the pathway to wealth creation for that family. And so yes, I mean, I think that is something that works well for many, many families. I think I have overarching questions about not just physical displacement, but cultural displacement. So yes, I agree. I think we need protections for people who are renters or who just can't, even if their house is bought, they can't afford the taxes. So that's something that happens too, is like folks just cannot keep up as property values rise with the tax increases. But I just, are we providing people with incentive to stay? And when they have a choice to leave, or are folks choosing to sell that house and take that pathway to wealth creation because they no longer recognize their neighborhood, which does not mean they're not willing to let it share it and have it evolve and change, but are just being like run over by yoga studios and coffee shops, right? I mean, and having the institutions that they love and mean so much to them sort of bought out and shifted. So it's I so appreciate that you appreciate the complexity, because it's not a simple story, but I always want to ask questions about people's motivations. Do folks really want to leave? If they do, then run and take that money and go. But what does it mean if folks do want to stay? And also just the assumption that if I bring in my resources, I'm making things better. Am I? What does that look like? Are my tastes winning? Do I have better tastes? Like, do I get to remake this neighborhood to serve me and everyone wins? I think those are problematic assumptions. So that's part of it too. But thanks, that's such a great question.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Evie. Can we all maybe just do this, or, you know, use the, that little emoji at the bottom. Thank you. I'm so grateful for the time that you have spent with us, not only this week, but last week. This has been very informative and very enriching and very challenging. So thank you, thank you, thank you. Y'all, I'm going to put you in breakout rooms because I want to give you a chance to discuss this. I'm going to give you 2 questions. And Charles, by the way, before I forget, Charles Key, I'm looking at you. I just made you co-host because I am going to have to leave probably before y'all are done to go get ready for worship. So I'm going to not only put you on the spot with closing the Zoom, but if you would close everyone in prayer once I've gone, I would appreciate that. But y'all, I'm going to put you in breakout rooms for about 15 minutes. And I want 2 questions to guide your discussion there. So the first one is a familiar one, and it is, what feelings have surfaced in me during Evie's presentation? This is something we should all be able to relate to, whether those feelings can be different, whether it was anger for any number of reasons, whether it's sadness or passion or despair or whatever it is. Name it and then name what you're going to do with it. So what feelings have surfaced and what am I going to do with those feelings? And then the second is, where does my story fit in? Where does my housing story fit into this larger story of housing and residential segregation in the United States? And because Evie kind of led us there, I think I would probably a subtitle or a sub question to that question is, where do I need to interrogate my own story? That's a strong word, but I think it's an important one. We all tell ourselves a story about where we live and why we live there. So let's begin in these brave spaces to interrogate that story a little bit for ourselves. Okay. I'm going to put you in breakout rooms. Please say yes to the invitation.
Welcome back.
Charles, you got left with a big responsibility for closing us up here.
Well, and somehow
I've got to pop off, but Mary Lou, will you invite people to the MICA meeting?
I sure will.
somehow, guys, I don't know if you can hear me, but I am out. I can hear you, but I'm not in Zoom. I don't know how that happened.
Charles, we can hear you.
We can hear you.
Hear you, and I could see you too. Then you
I can
will.
see you.
Yeah,
Yeah.
be careful. Be careful. We can see you.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah,
Wow.
I'll pick your nose.
Oh,
Charles.
yeah,
Charles.
there it is. There we are. Yes.
Charles.
Yes.
It's Mary Lou.
Hi, Mary Lou.
Just real quickly, could I follow up on what Melissa just said and just let everyone know that next Sunday afternoon, MICA will be having a public meeting, and you'll see information about it on the church material, but really want to encourage everyone to watch. It's an easy way to see what MICA is, how it works. And one of the asks one of the asks on Sunday will be to a representative of the city to restore the eviction fund that was cut earlier. And so it ties in with what we're talking about today.
Great.
Eviction. Oh, eviction.
Thank you, Mary Lou.
Yes.
Mary Lou, I have a quick question. Are y'all encouraging people to come because the more faces and voices are present, do y'all feel that that will give a greater weight to the request? Like it might have more consequences if there are more of us who show up?
Absolutely. That's one of the main principles, is that when politicians see, we had 2,000 people at the last public meeting. When public officials know that that many voters are watching what they're doing, it gives the people power.
Okay, thank you, because that seems like an easy way to engage on this subject.
Mary Lou.
Yes, and I'll send you an invitation.
Please do.
Mary Lou, I want you to know that This Week at Idlewild just popped up.
Oh, good. Thank you. Because the information about the public meeting next Sunday is in This Week at Idlewild. So please look.
And out there in cyberspace somewhere, just popped up. That's okay. Well, this has been a great program, and I think Evie is not on anymore, and we want to thank her again for great information and just great presentation, and what a wonderful student of the subject she's been, and for sharing that with us. I see that Sarah's token is on the call, but she's muted, and I'm guessing she's gone to work. So with all that, unless there's something else, I'll close this with prayer. Join me, please. Gracious Father, thank you for the opportunities you give us to share in your spirit and your love, to examine our own place in carrying out your work in the world. Thank you for the speaker we had today and the leadership in our church, bringing us to these important subjects. Be with us, Father, as we go forward into the week and into your service to start in a few minutes. And help us to remain aware of the blessings we have and the opportunities presented to share those blessings with others. In Christ's name, amen.
Yeah.
Good to be with y'all. Bye. See you in your worship.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Bye, guys.
Thank you very much.